Hey guys, so today we're going to talk a little bit about sealants and top coats. Since last week we did a video about the dyeing process, and usually sealants and top coats are the next step after the dyes are applied. The slight difference between sealant and top coat, a lot of times the word's used synonymously, but there is a little bit of a difference. A sealant is typically anything you put on it to lock in like a dye or to make it waterproof, whereas a top coat is traditionally something that you put on the surface layer as a final coat to give it a sheen or a luster that is desired. A lot of times one can be the other. So that's where that gets a little bit confusing. If you are using like an acrylic resin, for example, as your only coat, it is the sealant and the top coat. But you can also put in layers of like a satin sheen or a super sheen that penetrates deep inside it, and then there's several layers of that to lock in a pigment, and then use something like an acrylic resin on top of it to give it that look that is the sheen that would be the top coat. But we're going to go through the three big ones that I use commonly. Resin, atom wax, and satin sheen. This is strictly a water-based. This is essentially a liquid wax that when it dries, you're going to have that waxy finish. And this pretty much is a liquid that dries into a plastic almost, thus the word acrylic. Most of the time we use the acrylic resin on our products more times than not, just because we really like the shiny finish. It is probably your most water repellent clear coat, at least for the long haul. Wax is a very good water repellent for the short term, but over time wax tends to buff off, or if it's in sun exposure, it can get kind of soft and then rub off. But different chemicals for different priorities. Some are a little better at one thing and a little lacking in others. So depending on what application of leather you're going to be putting it through, you might want to choose a different one, and I'll kind of go through each one. But what I have here is a big spread of test strips, and I'm going to do all of my different colors in one in resin, one in satin sheen, and one in atom wax, so you can see a little bit of the difference in appearance and luster. And then as I'm doing each one of them, I'll kind of give you a rundown of what the benefits of each individual chemical is. Alright, so I've put the three different types of sealant on here. So pretty much what we've got is that the resin is the shiniest, which is also why it's most commonly used for a top coat. The satin sheen, it almost doesn't even really look like it changes the appearance of the surface of leather. So if you're trying to make something look old worldly, that it's been worn and been around for a long time, then satin sheen is probably what you want to go with. Satin sheen is also a great like penetrating type of sealant. So whenever we're really worried about color bleed, like if you've dyed something red all over, then usually we'll go over it with a couple coats of satin sheen before we do a top coat, like the acrylic resin. The wax is probably your second shiniest, but it's also got kind of this, yeah, sure, it's reflective, but it's got this kind of dull hue to it. But it's also pretty good to use for old worldly type stuff, because that's traditionally how they would have done it anyway. Like, 500 years ago, wax is what we used for a top coat to make it rain repellent, to keep dyes locked in, that kind of stuff. Wax can also be used as a top coat on top of the satin sheen. The only one you don't really want to use as a sealant with applying another top coat is the acrylic resin. If you've put an acrylic resin on there, because it hardens on the surface and gives you that kind of plasticized look, then it pretty much keeps all the other sealants from going down inside of it. So you can't just do layers of it and then apply something else, pretty much. I'm gonna pan over everything so you can get kind of an idea of the different visuals here. I feel like the one that it's easiest to see the difference is with the blacks, but with just about any of them you can see that the resin's definitely the shiniest. The satin doesn't really change the appearance much, and then the wax is the second shiniest. I only put the sealant on the bottom half of each one of these so you can see the original up there under the label of each one. One of the only differences in the dye types that we've used here is with the turquoise here. This is a water stain, which is a more topical type pigment that you apply, meaning that most of it sits on the top of the surface of the leather rather than penetrating down within it. And because of that, it kind of hardens and shrinks the pores on the top and doesn't really let the sealants penetrate down within it also. So the need for a top coat or a sealant is a lot less on this, which makes everything kind of sit on the top. Like I mentioned before, we primarily use acrylic Resolene on most of our products. If we end up having kind of a sealant coat and a top coat, it's usually the same chemical, because basically if you just keep slathering on acrylic Resolene, it'll keep penetrating down until it dries. Then once it dries on the surface, then any more coats you put on of the acrylic Resolene just sit on the surface, becoming your top coat. But what I have here are a couple of shoulders that are in production, and the one on the right has been Resolened with a single coat, and the one on the left has just been dyed. It's still waiting for its Resolene. But I'm going to go ahead and do a second coat, because the first one went pretty far down in there, so I don't believe the pigment's really going to go anywhere. But the second one we're going to put on just for luster. As I dribble a little bit there. We usually use foam brushes for putting on clear coats, whereas we use the daubers for the dye, because the daubers are pretty much just little tangles of fibers. And if you've ever gotten a like cat hair in a polyurethane coat or something, then you would know this pain. But your little tangle of fibers is going to leave little fibers all in your clear coat. So the foam brush, you don't really have that struggle. Usually when applying a clear coat, you want to use linear strokes, especially if you're using these foam brushes, just because it helps you eliminate some of these bubbles. And the bubbles are kind of your enemy in having a nice smooth finish. The leather's going to absorb most of the bubbles, especially on the first coat. So if you have real small ones, it's really not the end of the world. But what you really don't want is just standing pools of the clear coat. And that's essentially what the bubbles are. The second coat doesn't have to be near as heavy as the first. The first is really, your goal is to get it down in the leather. And the longer you keep it wet, the more the leather is going to absorb of it. Whereas the goal for the second coat is really just to get it on there evenly. And when you first put it on, all these different clear coats have a similar look to begin with. They're all kind of white and milky looking. The wax is a little more cream kind of colored. But when you're applying it, the way you know you can still move it around and that it's still liquid is if you can still tell that it's white. If it's white, you can continue moving it, getting it around to all the areas where it's not still white. That way you know you've got an even coat. But then once it is, you can't tell that it's white anymore, that means it's begun to dry. And once it has begun to dry and become clear, then you want to stop moving it around, because if you keep moving it around, you're going to make it cloudy. And you can stop moving it around with it still being white if the whole thing looks like it's evenly distributed and you've got your bubbles kind of small. Also, I always use the very tip of these foam brushes and not the rest of it, because if I end up getting too much on there by accident, that means most of my brush is still dry, so I can just rock the brush back and absorb some of my excess and then keep moving. I've got some real fine bubbles back here on the back, but for the most part, kind of pooled down there. But that's pretty much it. So now we'll let that dry, and that'll be as shiny as we probably want it. All right, so now that this is dry, you can kind of see the difference between the Resolene version and the pre-Resolene version. Like I said, this is 2 coats of acrylic Resolene. So most of the pieces we have end up looking like this when we're done, just because it's kind of the look we go for. But this one quite a bit more bland. If you were to hit it with like the satin sheen, this is more or less what it would look like when you're done. But you know, if you're trying to look old worldly, or like you've seen some battle or weathered or whatnot, then you probably wanted that duller version anyway. So I hope some of this information was helpful for you. There are lots of other top coats and sealants out there. Like I said, these are just the 3 that we typically use, but a lot of them mostly use the exact same principles and application process. So hopefully with this, you'll be good to go on some of the other projects that we'll be doing in the future on videos as well. If you enjoyed this and would like to see more of it, be sure to like and subscribe. We'll be doing more videos in the future and some planned projects to walk you guys through. And hopefully we'll see you there.